So we're looking at ethical hacking level 6 lab number 2. This one's on Kali networking. So take you through a couple of bits and pieces of information here, and then we'll see if we can get you to complete this lab. So first off, we are dealing with VMware Workstation as our virtual machine environment. And when you're dealing with VMware, there's different ways in which you can configure your networking. The first one is bridged. And if you have a look there, it will tell you about what's going on. If I'm going too fast, don't forget you can just pause the video and have a read. There's NAT, Network Address Translation. If you're not sure about Network Address Translation, the thing I'll say for the time being is just pause this video, drop it into Google, see what turns up. Or there's using a host-only network, which is VMNet, which is built into the virtual machine scenario. Again, have a look and see what's on there, and it will tell you about it. So, in terms of doing this lab, lab 1 should be completed, which means you should be using VMware and Kali Linux and your virtual machine environment, and it's getting you to be able to understand a little bit more about that environment that we're going to deal with in this lab here. So you should have lab 1 completed, and you should have that work updated and all that sort of thing, and marked and everything else. Up onto Moodle, we'll have a look. What we're doing though is we're going to look at how to configure networking inside your virtual machine environment. That's what this particular video is all about. So first thing is we want you guys to start at the Kali Linux environment that you're dealing with, and then log in and then go onto the terminal. So how do you do that? Well, start Kali, which you should already have installed. Open up VMware Workstation 16 Pro, which is the VMware version that we're using. And then if it does say about upgrading, you just click remind me later. That's not a problem. Otherwise, what should happen is you should be able to see a screen that looks a little bit like that. Power up VM using the link that's roughly speaking about there-ish, and then leave it a minute or two to boot up, and eventually you should be able to log in. You should remember your username and password because it's your first name, or at least it should be. Don't forget you set that up in the lab from last week, and then log in. Should be able to get to your Kali desktop. Should happen pretty smoothly and everything else. So then, assuming that you're there and everything's working, click on the terminal icon, this little black thing here in the top corner, and then it opens up the terminal, which looks a little bit like that. Now don't forget, you've seen Linux terminals before. We were dealing with Debian before, also Ubuntu if you were looking at the NetAcad class stuff. But from that perspective, we're using this particular terminal front end here to be able to put commands in and everything else. So the commands that we're dealing with involve IP addressing, because what we're doing is we're getting you guys to think about networking and how they work. So the first thing that we should do is bear in mind that our virtual machine configuration is currently set by default to NAT, and so network address translation. And so if we deal with any IP addressing and looking at them and see what they are, by using, for example, this command here, IP address show, it should tell us what's going on with the IP address for the configuration inside the virtual machine using NAT. So IP address show and hit return, and it will show us something that looks a little bit like this. So inside there we have a loopback address. We don't need to worry about that necessarily. We have an Ethernet 0 address. The Ethernet 0 is the network card that we're using for our virtual machine, and that, as you can see, currently is sitting at 192.168.183 as the network, and then my host is 129. Don't forget the /24 subnet mask means 255.255.255.0. That, by the way, is the MAC address. Those are the broadcast addresses for the network that we're on, both in terms of MAC and in terms of IP. IP version 6 as well, that's a local address. We don't need to worry about that. The one I'm interested in at the moment is the IP version 4 address that we have here. So, there we go. Now, as loaded in the lab instructions, you should see the text return with lots of information. There it is. 2 adapters, as we've seen, the loopback and the Ethernet one. We're not worried about the loopback adapter for now. We are, however, as we've said, looking at the one there for the time being. Anyway, IP link show shows you your Ethernet MAC address, just slightly different detail, slightly different command. I'm sure if you were to compare that screen to that screen, you'd be able to see there's certain similarities. Again, difference between IP address show and IP link show in terms of the way that the command works. And of course, just to show you this, as opposed to show the loopback as well as the Ethernet connection, we can just show the Ethernet connection, which in this particular scenario is Ethernet 0. So if you wanted to do that, can you see this command that we have here? IP address show F0, hit return, just shows us that individual network card as opposed to everything that's on the machine. Just a bit easier to see things sometimes. Now, in terms of the lab and getting you guys to do the work, that's your first screenshot to put into your ePortfolio document. It's the first IP address that we are dealing with. Now, if you're networking, you typically have a default gateway on your network, which is a way of getting out of the network that you're currently in onto other networks. For example, it's your default gateway on your home network that gets you onto the internet. Suffice to say, it looks as if we have the default gateway address shown there next to default via. So default gateway via that particular IP address. Useful. As you can see, it's on the same network. Of course, it would have to be. That's the nature of how it works. Hopefully, it's clear to you. In this case, this is my machine, so yours will probably or should be different. That the default gateway is 192.168.183.2 in this scenario. And there we go. That's what I've got set up on mine. Now, we would like you to be able to ping the default gateway, and so that's what I've got going on there. Now, if you run the ping command inside Linux without this -C switch, it just runs indefinitely. It just keeps going, keeps going, keeps going, keeps going. If you wanted to break out of that, you'd use Control-C, which is a standard break command. But what we'll do is we'll type the command in here, ping the IP address that you want to ping, -C followed by 4, and it means that we just send out 4 pings and get 4 responses. And as you can see there, it looks as if we can ping the default gateway. It looks we have that connectivity in place. Happy days. So we can ping the default gateway from inside the NAT configuration. There's the thing about if we just typed in ping, Control-C, there you go. If you want to learn a little bit more about NAT, feel free to have a look online. There's a Wikipedia page link there that you guys can have a look at. But what it is you've got a different address on your private network as the one that you have on your public network. Network address translation hides the address that you've got here, converts it to an address that you can use there. And that gets used quite a lot. I'm sure that you'll see it at different points on different courses that you do to do with networking and security. So that was NAT mode. We're going to use bridged mode as well, and we're going to show a comparison between them. So the scenario here is what we need to do is we need to go from NAT into bridged. And again, it's showing you guys how a virtual machine environment like VMware can use these different mechanisms, these different networks, these different IP addresses as a result. So if we want to make the change, we need to go into settings. So VM on your manual system, settings comes down. And then you might recognize that you've seen it before. And as you can see at the moment, we are using NAT. So if we want to change that, we can. We've got these other options here. And what we're going to do this time around is we're going to change over to using bridged. From NAT, we're going to use bridged instead. Also click replicate physical network connection state. Get that done, click OK. What that does is it puts us onto a different network. Now, the network that it will attach to will be the one that's on my host machine. And of course, my host machine, my laptop that's in front of me, typically gives me access to the internet, and it gets an IP address from my home broadband router. Again, that's not unusual, probably got the same thing at your house. So what have we got here? Well, do we have a different IP address? So in that mode, we had that IP address, and it's changed. We do have a different IP address. As you can see here, 192.168.1.0/24. That's my home network. It's probably the same as yours. Using 192.168.1.0 for a home network is not unusual. And as you can see, it's got a different IP address from the DHCP server on my home broadband, and has linked it because it's bridged, and we are replicating the physical network connection state. Whatever is on my host machine is now on my virtual machine. That's where that's come from. That's why it is different. And that's what this lot here means. So if you have a look at that there, that's the explanation as to where the IP address has come from. And it's different because we've set our network adapter to be on a different network from a NAT configuration to one that is bridged. Again, It's seeing those different IP addresses and it's seeing the different ways of configuring a virtual network. That's what this particular lab is all about, in case you guys weren't sure. Okay, so ping your home default gateway. Okay, it just so happens to be that my home default gateway is 192.168.1.254. Again, your home network, your setup is probably the same. I don't know if it is. If it's different, you need to ascertain what the difference is and ping the appropriate address. And as you can see there, I've pinged my home default gateway using my bridged VM connection, and it's decided to work, which is great. That's another screenshot that you need to put in your e-portfolio for when you put this work onto Moodle so that we can have a look at it, by the way. And then we can go on to another configuration that's available inside a virtual machine VMware environment. So we've got NAT, we've got bridged, we also got this, as it says here, a special private network to run testing, etc. on, which is a VMnet. So it's a network that's built into the virtual machine, it's built into VM Workstation Pro version 16, the one that we're using. Okay, so again, it's a bit of a test scenario, but it's something else that we'll use. Is building a network that stays inside the virtual machine, so you don't need to worry about it going outside of the virtual machine and creating any problems or anything with other networks that you might be on, which is what we mean by use for testing. So if we want to set that up, what we need to do again is go into VM settings, and here go from bridged to this selection here, which is one of these VM nets. Select VMnet 1, please, and click OK. That's the one that we'll go and use for now at least. And then again, what's happened with the IP addressing? Can you see it's changed again? We're now on to 192.168.83.0 for our network, and this has picked up an IP address of 128 through automatic IP address configuration. That's the next screenshot that you need to put into your e-portfolio, by the way. So again, it's looking at these different networks, giving us these different network IP addresses. Okay. So what are we going to do now? Well, we're not going to use VMware 0 or VMnet 0 or VMnet 1. We're going to use VMnet 15. No specific reason for that. And there's also no reason why we picked 192.168.15.0 as the IP address that we'd like to configure ourselves. It's just that what we'll do is we'll use this particular VM network for future labs. There's no particular reason why. It's just getting at the moment you guys to be able to see these different things. So how do you get onto that? Well, again, well actually not again, this is a different thing I do believe. It's not the VMware settings, it's the virtual network editor. So edit, go into the editor, brings up something that looks a little bit like this. VMnet 1 and VMnet 8 are currently shown. VMnet 8 is using NAT. Okay, well the first thing that we need to do, because it's all grayed out, is click Change Settings, which is this little thing down here. And when we click Change Settings, we have the ability to add various bits and pieces here, including going from bridged to something that might be different. So what we'll get you to do is actually click Add. Where's Add? Ah, that one there. So Add Network. What we'll do is we'll pick VMnet 15. Click OK. Wait a second or two for everything to become configured, and it's added to our list, which you guys can hopefully see, roughly speaking. There, just zoom that in a wee bit more. So VMnet 15, let's have a look at that. Can you guys see, by the way, down here, we've got this IP address assigned. Okay, we're going to change that to 15.0 by manually just typing it in. So we're on VMnet 15, host only, it's fine, it's connected, everything is set up. We're going to put in the IP address for the network. The DHCP is going to hand out the IP addresses to the clients inside the VMnet 15 configuration. All is well. So have that configured as it is, click OK, wait a couple of seconds for the update to take place. Then if you go back into your VM settings, we should see that we are going to have to change from VMnet 1 to VMnet 15, the one that we've put in. So you select that from the list, click it, click OK, and then let's see what happens. Now, I'll use the word zoom function even more to make this visible if I just keep doing that. The first time I tried to see what the IP address was, it hadn't actually had long enough to configure. I did it pretty quickly, like a couple of seconds after. Maybe need to leave it for about 10-15 seconds for everything to work. So it didn't like it, the connection was down, the old IP address was still in place. When it decided that it was alive and working again, can you see here it's gone on to 192.168.15 and has given out an IP address from DHCP for the client. So, happy days with that. So that's basically where we are with this particular lab. Just let me put that like that. So this is a comparatively short one. There's not quite so much to do. As opposed to be a half-hour video, this one's going to clock in about 15 or 16 minutes. We're nearly done. So what we tried to do there is show you the main ways of configuring networking inside this particular VMware Kali scenario so that we can do more work with that in the future. So in terms of getting your screenshots for the ePortfolio so that you can get that work submitted, please get that sorted out, follow the instructions in the lab. And the last thing that you need to put in is the information here. Now, I'm not giving you my answers, it's up to you to fill this in, and that basically means that you've completed this lab, you've gone and seen the things that you need to put in, think about the different IP addresses and the different ways in which these networks work. We can use that knowledge in the future. If you complete the ePortfolio screenshots and then this table that's in front of you in part 4, we will be happy and the work will be done. And that is us for this video. So I will just click stop recording in a minute, well, less than a minute I suppose, but I will basically say that I will see you guys next time. Thank you very much. Bye for now.